thank you to the speakers for two excellent papers. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but I'd like to give our speakers 5 minutes or so to respond to one another and to ask any questions that they might have, and then we'll open up the floor for wider conversation.
This is the Michael show.
Right.
So Michael.
Yes, Mike.
I hesitated to include Roman Catholic parishes in what I was describing, but over lunch and actually in other conversation we've talked about that.
Right.
So if I could ask you to kind of say a little bit about what the church leaving the building looks like in the Roman Catholic context.
Right. We were chatting at lunch about the differences between East Coast and West Coast, and of course, as you know, Michael narrated some of the closings and consolidations of churches on the East Coast, and that's certainly true of Catholic churches in the main urban centers of the East Coast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, etc. But here, ironically, in Southern California, teeming with Catholics, we are tending to just build bigger buildings because we have a supply and demand problem due to immigration, really. Were it not for immigrants, the Catholics in some would be losing numbers, but we remain at about a quarter of the United States population, partly because of immigration. And so whether or not we're doing an effective pastoral job in Catholicism would be anybody's guess because we're still crowded. And so they're building bigger buildings in California while closing and consolidating neighborhood churches within eyesight of each other on the East Coast. I would love to know more about intense first-person accounts, because I think, in a sense, you're appealing to that for pastoral leaders in your next study. And I'm trying to figure out how we do that with secular Catholics, to do intense first-person accounts without judgment, with humble listening. Can you help me with that?
Well, I think ethnography would be the way to proceed, the way that anthropologists and other social scientists, rather than just with a lot of money, getting big samples and a lot of information about them, rather both randomly as well as selectively trying to sit down and taping them, transcribing them, editing them, get first-person narratives. Now, what I was talking about was more influenced by a couple of books that have come out recently. Lillian Daniel, who writes for Christian Century, a UCC pastor in Illinois, and Martin Copenhaver did a wonderful book called This Odd and Wondrous Calling, in which they did first-person alternating chapters about their own coming to the ministry, their seminary training, their spouses, their families, their experience in very, very different parishes because they've moved several times. That's very moving and a real sort of insight into being parish pastors and being parts of communities in the early 21st century. Even more interesting, and this is much more difficult, is a volume done by someone who used to be the Dean of Students at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Back in the late 70s, he interviewed a whole graduating class, and then 25 years later was able to get about half of them to interview about what happened to them as pastors in the 25 years. Absolutely phenomenal account. And I can look up the title and the information or give it out later on. But it's that methodology that I wouldn't say that we don't need surveys, we do. But since oftentimes you use the tools that are at hand, and since we have this wonderful sort of community now of priests who have been our interns, and since I heard so many of the stories from them and from other clergy colleagues, that's where I went first. But I would say something like an ethnography would be the direction.
In the Catholic community, with respect to the emerging lay ministry cohort, the best website for that is emergingmodels.org. That's the Emerging Models of Pastoral Leadership, in which they do some first-person accounts of what is it like to be a deacon who used to be a deacon on a large staff but is now the deacon who's the pastor of a rural parish in the absence of an ordained Catholic priest, or to be a lay woman who has been the administrator appointed by the Catholic bishop, and to have a sort of circuit rider priest on the weekends who comes through 3 parishes. And so that website has been fascinating. In our own Archdiocese of Los Angeles, we have about 24 appointed pastoral associates who are functioning as associate lay pastors in Catholic parishes throughout the diocese, but we have 200-something parishes, so it's still a small number.
Okay, well, I think we can open up the floor to questions. Are we using the microphones? Should people come up to the microphones? Or, okay, so if you have questions, please come up to the microphone. Or shout very loudly.
Can I just say one thing? I realized after I finished that I didn't say something I intended to, and it's simply this, that I only gave a couple of kind of case study examples. Frackville, PA, Wappingers Falls, New York. There are many, many other types or ways in which parishes are responding to demographic changes. I did focus on where I live, the Hudson Valley, the Northeast, and a little bit on the rest of the Rust Belt, so-called. But there are many other models. I just wanted to make that clear.
The church, before Vatican II, was very concerned, and apologetics was part of the education of most of us who went to Catholic school from cradle to grave. And what's happened now, we're dealing with ecumenism, which is quite a different kind of approach. But I see that Mr. Donahue of New York, who is head of the Catholic League, has decided to take on the abused people by the church by trying every case one by one. As a lawyer, I can tell you that is not the best approach to life. And I'm kind of wondering why we don't have one bishop speak out and say, Mr. Donahue, you do not represent the gospel in any way, shape, or form. That's a tragedy. And that's the reason why, during this period of time until now, 1/3 of Calvary Chapel, and that's no longer a non-denomination, it's a denomination, has 1/3 of our Catholics in their denomination. Saddleback Church, which is one of the largest churches in the nation, also has a huge number of Catholics. Mm-hmm. I was out of the church for 18 years, and so I went to these churches and got to know people in them. And I can tell you that apologetics and the approach of Mr. Donahue is very, and I think, anti-Catholic.
Thank you. I don't really know how to respond. I do think that one of the challenges in the Catholic community is sort of stealing the label. There's a lot of unchristian behavior out there among Catholics saying, you're not Catholic, you are Catholic. Or you're not Catholic enough. And that's one of the reasons I'm trying to propose something. I suppose Gilkey is not the best language in the world. It's pretty technical language, but I like what he's trying to do, which is to get out of the plot and underneath it to the theme of what really does it mean to think spiritually like a Catholic, because that kind of access to identity would be a container large enough to not have us think only on the surface and therefore have a sort of Catholic meter and say you've scored a 7 out of 10. But rather to talk about sort of abiding spiritual values that could be underneath our surface differences. And there are surface differences, and we're not likely to resolve those differences, but one of the least Christian things that could happen, I think, is for two Christians to tell each other that the other one isn't, and that's happening a lot in Catholicism, unfortunately.
It's happening in Orthodoxy, too.
Thank you both for your presentations. Within the nonprofit world, there's a rising trend, particularly amongst philanthropy, and renowned philanthropist for the social innovation model. And this would be where, simply put, a nonprofit would endeavor to accomplish its mission while also producing a viable widget that can be sold. One might think about the student who recently graduated from the Stanford School of Social Innovation, went to India, hired first caste Indians to collect plastic bottles, second caste Indians to recycle them and turn them into LED lanterns, gave them back to first caste Indians, basically eliminating their utility bills because they were using kerosene and improving the fire safety, turned around and sold those same LED lanterns to Walmart to support that ongoing mission, then gave the couple $1 million back to the philanthropist. This kind of catalytic, social innovative philanthropy is the kind that I'm very interested in another life outside of my priesthood. However, I wonder, and I'd like to have you comment on, whether or not, particularly Father Michael Lacon, and that doesn't work just to say Michael, I guess Father Michael, whether or not a parish, as you were talking about a worker priest, is it possible, without betraying its essential identity as a Eucharistic community, is it possible, and without reductionism to rolling pierogies to sell at an ethnic bakery, is it possible for a parish to develop a model where through innovation it might create something meaningful for the community, as well as employ people needing jobs, and sustain itself and its practical mechanisms that it needs as a concrete community, and do all of this without losing its core and essential identity as the church? Is that possible, or are those things too much in contradiction with one another?
It might be possible if they had a pastor like you, and I mean that in sincere affection. The only thing I would say is there's no reason why not. The trouble that I would see is that so many communities, and by the way, the data also indicates this, are shrinking in size. We used to have so many more parishes because demographically we needed to be able to walk to them, ride to them in a cart or on a horse. Now, as in the UK, we call them redundant. I mean, in my little village, we have the same parishes that are literally 4 minutes away in the next village and that are 5 minutes away in the next village. And I mean, I don't think that they can go on forever. They're being sustained now by a lay pastor, by a weekend pastor, etc. But eventually, somewhere down the line, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, some of those parishes are going to have to become either buildings that are used only very rarely, or merge into a building that will contain them all. But you asked a much better question, and I would say that it isn't just an issue of staying afloat financially or having somebody to preside at and celebrate the Eucharist together with everybody else. They've got to have some other reason for living, and that's what I hear in what you're saying. And first and foremost, that might be, if you haven't been this before, to become part of your community. And that's where, at least for us, I have to say, the Western churches have a much longer tradition of doing this. They're the ones who set up food pantries and soup kitchens. They're the ones who established ministerial or clergy associations. Many of our people are still, for them it's alien to become part of a community. In fact, I had I did a wedding once at a parish in New Jersey, and the lady said, "We're just waiting for everybody to die." And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that, but that's what she said. We're just waiting till we all die, and then, Father, you and the bishop can do whatever you want with this. So that's, but I'm not here to be pessimistic. I'm not here to drown the afternoon. That may have sounded like it, but there certainly are places, there are parishes which have decided not to die. And, you know, they're doing things. I don't know of anyone that's done what you've described.
Well, except for monasteries.
Well, monasteries, yeah.
If you think about the monastic community that supported itself through making something.
Making things, yeah.
And without losing its identity.
That's right. That's right.
And some of them are very, very small.
Yeah.
But you said worker priest, and I wonder if you could have a worker parish.
Yes, yeah, my answer is yes.
You just talked about small churches, and one of the things I didn't mention, but I think is important to mention, is the Emerging Models study that was published last July about Catholic parishes says that on average there are 1,200 members in the Catholic parish. Or is it 1,200 households? I'm sorry, I can't remember which, but it's 1,200. The reason it seems like it would be 1,200 households to me is that my own parish in Santa Monica has 7,000 households. And a huge staff, lay and ordained. It's enormous. It's a Catholic megachurch. But one of the things that this Emerging Models study noted, but did not develop, and I think it needs developing, is that the rate of involvement, of participation, of engagement is reduced after 200 households. So the smaller the church, the more engaged are the people. Well, and of course, everybody in this audience knows that. But that's a big family secret in Catholicism if we're building bigger buildings. And we're building bigger buildings because of our shortage of priests, not because of our shortage of Catholics.
In my diocese, there are almost 60 parishes. Half of them have 50 people or less in them. And that's not unusual for Eastern churches, whether they're Catholic or Orthodox. The parishes always were smaller, but because of the demographic changes, they've shrunk even more. Now, it is interesting to note, though, that the people at Pew and people like Chavez and others who do, larger survey research will tell you that 1 out of every 4 parishes across the mainstream have 50 or less. 1 out of every 4. And that the average parish size of mainstream churches is about 75. It's under 100 now. So, this is where, something that looks like a curse may in fact be a blessing, because what you're actually finding now is you have a much smaller group of people. That's why when I said one of the leading features, I think in the future, based on what is happening right now, is going to be a really communal parish. Diana Butler-Bass has called them intentional communities.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity for the Rest of Us and all the other publications that came out of that, where people know each other and people say, I'm here because I want to be here. I like the food here. In my parish, they say that, right? I like the food here. I like the singing here. I like the liturgy here. I like the people here. Now, a theologian might say, I wonder whether that's, doctrinally sophisticated enough. Forget about it. It's Eucharistic.
Hi. Thank you so much for taking, being able for me to express some of my suggestions. I essentially really being astonished here, but I think this particular subject matter, what we just hear, is, I believe, needs a little bit 4 or 5 more symposiums. So complicated for my. But first of all, let me say this. My question is here, if you want to prolong in our Catholic faith, which I just heard, is this. What are we looking for? Quantity? Or are we looking forward to quality in our faith? What I really haven't heard yet here is that the basis of our faith is, number one, is what I heard one gentleman questioned here, is the apologetics. That only can come from one thing, and that is, are we nurtured and been educated in the Word of God, the Bible? And it seems to me that more and more I hear theses, I hear explanations, opinion, tangents of people that have some idea where we're heading for. But the basis of our faith is the gospel, that we study this and that we come really, and be able to wrap our brains around it and see if we can really interpret really what Christ wants us to be and look like. And being more in our faith, and I really am a Catholic, and I sense that I have more and more work ahead of me, and I call it the rehabilitations of Roman Catholics, that gosh, as I think Mr. Michael and Michael just already has said, becoming more separated from one another. Because if I talk to a Catholic, I feel, my goodness, I rather talk, what you said, to a Buddhist and a Hindu, and I feel much more that we going for progress than I talk to a Christian next to me. And I like to have your comments on that, because one thing I do know that I don't hear that from the pulpit. I think what we hear now, this is what I like to hear from my parish, how we solve these hindrances or that prevent us from progress in our faith. So if you can clarify this, how we can solve, because you have here, I think Michael Horan says, is intra-parish dialogue possible with a big question mark? Absolutely. We got to have the will, number one, to do so. And then I ask you the question, can we maybe motivate our priest on Sundays to really bring us to us, hey, church is fine, but when you exit the church, there is where our faith starts. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I would say this, that I think what I hear beneath your comment is the call to recognize that churches are the blessed means of salvation, that salvation is in Jesus Christ. And the churches, all of them, are means, they're a path. And when we forget that, I guess we can all fall into a sort of ecclesiolatry that has us be much more interested in the life of the means rather than in the end, the goal, which is Jesus Christ, right? And to know Christ, to come to know Christ more deeply as a disciple. So I think your comment's very helpful in that sense, that it calls us back to the real basics and underneath the surface of our differences. And I think that's why we're gathered. So thank you.
I would just add, John Paul II used to say, don't be afraid. I think it was Timothy Johnson and Gary Wills, both in recent books about the New Testament, pointed out the fact that the Gospels largely take place outside of any ecclesiastical building, any worship space. The one scene that's in the Gospels is a disaster in the synagogue in Nazareth, and a near disaster in the portico of the temple. But what's interesting is that that's paralleled by letters then, that are letters from inside particular churches to other churches, sent around in the first century of the Common Era. So I think in a sense, if you look at the very beginnings of the faith and the very beginnings of church, they had small numbers and they had a world which was largely other than themselves. So I don't know that we need to be as afraid as some voices indicate that we should be afraid of the secular culture, of other religions, of an immoral and promiscuous society. We're more like the church found itself in the first century than ever before.
We have a little bit less than 10 minutes in the session, so a couple of questions.
Hello, I want to thank you both for your reflections. This is an issue that's of deep concern to me, the concern of Christians leaving their churches. I've never been a fan of the phrase lapsed Catholics. I liked inactive Catholics better. I've been intrigued by this phrase secular Catholics, although I personally use the phrase of Christians in the margins of their church, whether they're either struggling with their faith or their clerical leadership has sort of abandoned them to zero in on a more faithful remnant. Something that stood out to me in both of your reflections is the sense of young adults. Once children and teenagers have gone through periods of catechesis and have matured into young adulthood in their early 20s and of course eventually 30s, how are then they going to choose to live their faith lives? Because they are the ones that are most likely that are leaving the churches, that are the decaying parishes. And now we're trying to figure out how do we reach out to them and bring them back and eventually their kids. I come out of the Catholic tradition, so I do not know what the Orthodox parallel would be for this, or what Protestant parallels would be, but I imagine there are some. In Catholicism, we have turned the sacrament of confirmation, separating it from its initial sort of, threefold process of initiation to almost a puberty rite. I've spent the last year as a confirmation catechist at a parish near USC, and one of the things that I've seen in my very limited one-year experience, as well as just from anecdotal experiences from other friends of mine, is that once these students have hit age 16 and they've completed confirmation, that's it. And when I talk to other young adults, people my age, the last thing they learned was at confirmation or at a Catholic high school. And as far as they're concerned, that's all they need to know about their faith, which I find to be a very elementary level faith. It seems to me that shouldn't be just the ending, but rather the beginning. I presume there are similar struggles in Orthodox as well as Protestant communities as to when adolescents are ending that period, they're beginning that transition into young adulthood. How are we able to reach out, grasp them, not just give them the intellectual understanding of their faith, but a personal experience of Christ, so that when they become 17, 18, 19, when they get to college, they can then willfully pursue this on their own. My own parish is not a big mega parish. I go to the Newman Center of USC. It's small, I like it, and we all purposely want to be there. So it's an active community. I purposely avoid sort of the neighborhood parish, regular family parishes, because they're boring to me. And I've been going to the same college parish ever since I was in high school, and I'm in my mid-30s now.
Right. I'm not sure what the question is.
Oh,
I mean, I think you've
I apologize if that was too
narrated it very well, the issue that young adults don't find meaning in particular parishes, but they seem to find meaning more in the intentional communities to which Michael was referring. And it sounds like you've found a really worthwhile, meaningful, intentional community at SC. And so, as Michael was saying, I think what really happens in the successful Catholic parishes that you're passing, but if they're successful at making people feel connected, it's because, well, in my own parish, we identify ourselves when we meet each other and we don't know each other. We say, hi, Tony, are you a 5:30 or a 9:30 worship service time? And that's how we have our intentional communities. In some Catholic parishes, it's sort of working to the extent that an intentional community can be found in worship service, but often these communities are smaller, and that's, I think, what we're getting at with the size issue too, because how many people approximately are at your SC community? 200? 100?
About 500 amongst 3 different masses.
Okay, right, great.
I guess to be succinct, my question was, how do Christian faith communities, whether Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, how do you foresee us reaching out and engaging teenagers as they become young adults to have a vibrant experience of their faith? Because I'm thinking this would be one step forward to halting the decaying of parish life.
Could I just say, one thing is demographically, all those teenagers you're talking about don't stay there. They go away to college, and then they go away to work. That's the trend in American society. People are mobile. Very few people end up living in the town that they were born in or went to grade school or high school in. Second thing is, be welcoming. One of the qualities of good parishes is that they're welcoming. There are many parishes that are not. They're turned in. So.
We have time for one more question.
To pick up on the immigration issue, it strikes me that within the Orthodox tradition, the immigrant communities are of a very different character, especially now, than in the Catholic community, especially with the Latino population. Would you care to discuss with each other some of the similarities and contrasts with what it means to minister to the immigrant church?
For us, the new immigrants from Eastern Europe and other places pose a very, very complicated challenge. Many of them are not really churched, and they're not interested in being churched, partly because they grew up in families where they couldn't go to church under the Soviet regimes. So when they come to this country, they'll come. My Orthodox students at City University are amazed that people go to church more than once or twice a year, because that's what they're used to. Christmas or Easter, a funeral, a wedding, a baptism, all of those rites of passage, yes. But the idea of going to church more often, or going most every Sunday, is something that doesn't register to them. And they're cradle Orthodox and are very proud of that. So it's very difficult to reach out to them, because the model that we have, some of them will say, this is like Baptist or Protestant. You actually talk to one another after the liturgy, Oh, and it's all in English, and so forth. So it's really challenging. It's a lot more complicated than I could talk about at this point in time, and it really is quite different than, I think, the Latino experience.
I think so too. When you look at the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, the Catholic Church has been outstanding at welcoming the immigrant. Outstanding. My concern, frankly, is that's all we know how to do. I'm worried. I'm actually worried. So when people throw the stat at me that, well, it's 40% of the church is Latino, well, that's interesting. Some of those people are immigrants. Not all of them are immigrants. And not all immigrants need education. Not all immigrants come, sort of in a vulnerable place, but many do. And it seems that historically Catholicism has known how to reach out to those immigrants. The challenge in looking at the stats that Michael mentioned from the Pew Forum is this: what happens after it's a success story? What happens after they graduate from Loyola Marymount University or Boston College or Georgetown or Notre Dame? What is available to them in parish life that had the last questioner, Ryan, ask about USC and his intentional community, because he passes parishes on the way there. So I'm concerned, frankly, not that we won't figure out how to nimbly respond to the next wave of immigrants, whoever they are, although the challenge will be in the fact that this wave of immigrants isn't bringing with it its own clergy. So that'll be very interesting. But I'm concerned as well for those who are second, third, fourth, fifth generation, whatever their ethnicity. How do they negotiate their faith in a very different postmodern America?
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our speakers.
Another excellent session. We have a coffee break in the atrium for the next 20 minutes, and then we will reconvene for our final session before we have closing remarks.
And I'm very honored and happy to introduce our two speakers. They've elected that Father Justin will go first, so I will now introduce him. Father Justin Matthews is a priest of the Orthodox Church in America. He, however, serves right now at a Serbian Orthodox church, and I guess at one point he was Episcopalian, so he's a man of many talents. He also has a business degree from Belmont University in Nashville. The church he now works at is St. Mary of Egypt in Kansas City, Missouri. He was executive director of Focus, the Fellowship of Orthodox Christians United to Serve. He stepped down in December and is now focusing his attention on being a husband and father, and as well as getting involved in entrepreneurial work that has a social purpose, as we heard a little bit about at the last session. So that's Father Justin, and I'd like to introduce you and ask you to welcome him.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. You'll forgive me if I use a little bit of technology. I realized in the effort to print out my paper, I've neglected to somehow grabbed the first, or the two middle pages of my paper. So, we'll have some extemporaneous thought here also. But no, at any rate. I've been asked to offer some reflections about Orthodox Christian efforts towards unity, specifically those taking place through social action ministry in the United States and the potential impact of such upon Orthodox Christian unity and ecumenical dialogue. The landscape is so well tilled now during these incredible last hours and days worth of sessions that I really am not going to spend any time speaking about the ecclesial or administrative efforts, formally speaking, as relates Orthodox Christian unity, ecumenical dialogue, and social action in our church, in the Orthodox Church. Rather, I hope today to offer, from a practical and tactical standpoint, some reflections from my last 3 years of work, which has been as the founding executive director of Focus North America, the Fellowship of Orthodox Christians United to Serve. Also standing for the areas in which we work: food, occupation, clothing, understanding, and shelter. It was, is, and attempts to be, you might imagine, sort of the Catholic charities of the Orthodox Christian Church, which we've really not had anything like that at all. There have been other efforts within specific jurisdictions of the church. I can think about Philoptochos in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, the Women's Ladies Society, although it's actually not just for ladies, it means the love of the poor, and other good efforts, but really we hadn't had a pan-Orthodox umbrella until recently. Now, to be honest, I just want to make a caveat here. My personal bias leans heavily towards theological action rather than theological reflection, although I fully recognize the importance of theological reflection and its critical pursuit. Perhaps my perspective and my leaning is coined well by a man named Father Roberto in Canada, who runs a ministry called St. John the Compassionate Mission, which is comprised of mainly homeless men and women who come to him for worship, but also work in a bread bakery, social entrepreneurial endeavor, not unlike the one I was mentioning earlier. He termed this approach a lived theology. For me, helpful theological reflection is applicable reflection, that reflection which possesses some sort of kinetic potential. For me, this is often born through the pangs of labor and written with hands that are still dirty from the struggle, soiled, not in the quiet moments after the press. I crave Christian action with deliberate debrief and verbatim afterwards that will illumine this lived theology from within a lived tradition. And as such, I resonate deeply with the life and ministry of a recently canonized saint, Saint Mother Maria Scotsova of Paris, who, and those who labored with her, men and women alike, lay and clergy, who labored in Paris and had a society aptly named Orthodox Action. Her canonization was celebrated in May 2004 at the Cathedral of St. Alexander Nevsky in Paris. And among those present was actually Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger, the Archbishop of Paris, and a Jew by birth, who subsequently placed Saint Maria, Mother Maria, as she's affectionately known, on the calendar of the Catholic Church in France. One wonders if there are any other saints of the post-schism Christian world that we live in who are on both the Catholic and the Orthodox calendars. Mother Maria once wrote in her journal, reflecting on those who would criticize her for missing services or showing up late to them because she had been offering hospitality. She said, "Piety, piety, but where is the love that moves mountains?" I've often imagined what it would have been like to be there as Mother Maria rushed in late to the Divine Liturgy in the little chapel at Larue, when she didn't skip it entirely, because she was helping somebody in need, living the second great gospel commandment of the Lord, to love our neighbor. I imagine the small breeze that caresses my cheek as she passes by me to find her place at the women's kleros, and I smile, knowing that I have just felt the ruah, the breath of the Lord, the divine breath which makes me a living soul. Holding this sentiment in my heart, I would like to begin my reflection in earnest. So today I'll begin with 3 affirmations about the importance of social action ministries that I hope we can agree to, and then perhaps offer the surface, but a few troubling barriers to the proliferation of this Orthodox Christian social action ministry in North America, and thus the pan-Orthodox and ecumenical dialogue that they generate. So 3 affirmations. Firstly, the kenotic self-abasing, self-emptying action of taking up our cross to love God by loving our neighbor uniquely creates an environment for deep spiritual and psychological transformation within the heart like nothing else I've experienced. And I'd like to propose to the gentleman who asked the question here in the front about what to do with the youth, take them on short-term missions and get them out of the church and into the city to meet Christ in the poor. In my opinion, and in my own experience, I and many others I know are only Christians today because our spiritual fathers and mothers, by the way, often untrained youth workers, our spiritual fathers and mothers led us into these places of vulnerability where we met Christ in the poor. And we finally understood the divine liturgy and the scriptures as exegeted by Christ the homeless. This environment is rich with true ecumenical potential, unencumbered by the formalities of the public forum or the prerequisite intelligence of the academy. It's a place where bureaucratic structures, schisms, titles, ceremony, and all manner of externality are rendered powerless and laughable. I think about the story of Matushka Michaela, the one I spoke about earlier, who we recently buried, who told me before she was ever really even a Christian, she had a very traumatic upbringing with a particular family member, and she had to escape abuse by living under, or by fleeing underneath the porch of her house. And when she would go there, there was a person, a presence, someone named Michael, who would visit her there and comfort her. Only later did she learn about Archangel Michael and took the name Michaela, and is convinced utterly that it was the Archangel Michael protecting her there. The second affirmation is that social action ministries lead the church, as we heard in somewhat today, lead the church out from behind her walls and into the church of the world. This is perhaps another way of looking at the church leaving the building, a third lens of that phrase perhaps. Here we leave the ancient and fortified structures, and we find ourselves in a church adorned, as Mother Maria of Paris said, with living icons, still trembling in anticipation of the Lord's imminent parousia. And in this mission field, those on the streets overturn our tables and demand intellectual honesty of us, and above all, impartial respect for all. Because of this, dying communities, struggling parishes are winnowed, renewed, reconciled as they unexpectedly find themselves the Pharisees, the sinners, and the tax collectors in the story, rather than Christ. And thus they forgive and are forgiven. I can think about two parishes in a town not far from here in California, Southern California, of a particular jurisdiction who had split years ago, maybe 40 years ago, and hadn't spoken with one another. The rumor is, and I don't even know if it's true, is that at one parish council, somebody in the heat of an argument brought a gun in. And that in the heat of this argument, there's somebody in here knows exactly what I'm talking about. But in the heat of this argument, two parishes split. They never did anything together since. Never worshiped together, never went to Pan-Orthodox Vespers together, never did anything together, and generations, at this point 3 generations of families hated each other. Until one day, the grace of God brought them together through this mechanism. In this case, Focus North America was attempting and has established, with the help of numerous local clergy and faithful volunteers, primarily through their work, this ministry to serve and to love the poor at a mission called God's Extended Hand. Now, frankly, Orthodox had been going there for years, but we began to encourage other people to get involved in this good work so that we could expand it and eventually turn it into Focus San Diego. Now there's another wonderful work there called Orthodox San Diego that has taken up that mantle, and it continues there. But I was privileged, and I'll always remember when I looked, and this was not planned, I looked to my right, I looked to my left, and there were the 2 parish council presidents of those 2 particular parishes serving side by side and serving the poor. And somebody told me later, that's the first time those 2 parishes and those congregations have ever come together to do anything. That didn't happen through a planned dialogue. That didn't happen within the walls of the church. That happened because we went out to do church, to be Christ. And in this church of the world, we're honest, more honest with who we really are. We find that we are repentant arch-adulterers, mitred martyrs, and mitred murderers, tonsured thieves who lead flocks of the sick and dying, with foreheads still glistening with fragrant chrism. Here new canons are written, and we search old encyclicals for guidance, with a freedom that's not permitted elsewhere officially. We seek to speak the same gospel with new words, to find therapeutic ways to heal new kinds of wounds with ancient medicine common to all Christians from all traditions. Here disciples crowd into small community centers, basements, and other forgotten places of this empire to meet Christ in his most distressing disguise and to witness paralytics walk again. Here miracles are expected. Angels and those vexed with unclean spirits are not imaginary. And when we pray, give us this day our daily bread, hunger truly punctuates, thy will be done. Here in the church of the world, we are filled with the Spirit and receive power when we touch the hem of the Lord's sleeve in embracing someone in need. This Spirit and power is what animates our anamnesis, our divine remembering on Sundays, whenever we serve the liturgy, and it gives feeling to our antiphons and to our hymns each Sunday when we gather in our respective traditions from the streets, now as the church within her walls, to receive the Eucharist and to prepare to be sent out again. The third affirmation that I'd like to offer is that sustained social action ministries create a space for transformation and healing, and they lead participants over time into that deeper communion with God, and therefore inevitably into a deeper and more authentic koinonia with each other. At some point, simply put, people find that we're simply too in love with the people that we serve with to tolerate any schism. They're our friends. The act of two or three gathering together to take up this cross, this self-emptying love of the neighbor as our expression of love of God, can even transform things that divide us into the very thing that unites us. Like the iconostasis in our Orthodox churches joins, not separates, the worldly from the otherworldly, the living and the dead. Our social, economic, cultural, sexual, religious, whatever you want to put in there, those differences become the holy ground, where in fact in the struggle to love one another in spite of those differences, we find the communion we seek. We find that union which Christ promises. We see then one another as God himself, deserving of our profound and authentic veneration, as Mother Maria put it. Now, having offered these three brief affirmations that I'm sure most of us can agree to, hopefully, they're fairly basic and nothing terribly original, I'd like to offer some thoughts about the importance of social action ministry, but I want to talk about the barriers. Again, not to be pessimistic, but to be realistic. Because if what I've proposed as affirmations are really this important, and if social ministry, as I'm proposing, is actually the crucible in which, at least from the bottom up, we're going to work this stuff out, then it's important that we promote it as vigorously as possible. To me, everything that the bishops and the conferences and all the things that we talk about, the rubber's going to hit the road, just like we talked about yesterday with the Council of Florence in the 15th century, when we go back home to the parishes, when we go to implement this stuff with regional parishes, with people that don't live around here, with people that are working 2 jobs and 80 hours a week, and all those dynamics from every different talk that we've talked about, this, I believe, is one of those, I like the word that Dr. Michael used earlier, this container. It's maybe not the container for all of our Orthodox identity, but it's a container, social action ministry, for at least working out, I think, so many of the problems that we face in the church when it comes to ecumenical dialogue, and for us particularly, pan-Orthodox integration and administrative unity. 10 minutes, Lord have mercy. Thank you. 3 barriers. The first barrier I call the honeycomb. And it relates to this tendency within the modern Orthodox world, in spite of our ecclesiology, which claims to marry synodality with primacy. It's this tendency to centralize all control of Christian activity within the priest of the parish, the bishop in the region, and the primate of the church. What do I mean by the honeycomb? It's become my experience that although American culture is fairly consistent regionally, as Father Michael could speak about deeply, Orthodoxy in America is not, in my opinion, regionally similar. In fact, I would argue, having traveled the last 3 years to every major metropolitan area with Focus North America and visited every jurisdiction under the sun in the Orthodox Church, and then many Protestant and fewer Catholic, but many Protestant churches and ministries during that time, that every Orthodox parish actually has its own culture that has more in common with its ecclesial structure above it than the parishes in its own proximity within the region. That it's almost impossible, therefore, it makes it impossible, if we're talking about a practical level, and here I'll put on the business hat, to scale up a social action ministry that's national, on a national level. If you think about how businesses scale up, or universities scale up, you've got to have a common culture. There are certain prerequisites for effective scale up. You can go to the undergraduate university library and read all about this in business. It's the same, I believe, it's the same phenomenon. And because we live in this honeycomb of orthodoxy, you can't come up with a scalable model, I would argue. Now, my dear friend, the chairman of Focus North America, Charles Agelat, and I have talked a lot, and the founder of Focus has really argued vehemently, and we've gone back and forth about this, on whether or not a centralized model and the power of a centralized model allows for that kind of scale up. I've come after 3 years to not embrace that opinion. I actually believe that now, and here I'll offer a little out of order here in light of the time, that I actually think what we need to do is decentralize these kinds of ministries. So I would propose that new national ministries start to be more catalytic, teaching. Let's inject the DNA into the local parish and facilitate its growth and allow them the ownership and control over it. But at any rate, there is another model that's prevalent and current and follows right along with the hierarchical structure, and that's this dominant primacy. I propose that besides the obvious causes for this consolidation of immigrants around the preservation of mother cultures that causes this centralization, that a major cause is that our orthodoxy is not allowed to cross-pollinate naturally. And there are shining exceptions to this, but in many cases, the clergy don't challenge their congregants to give significant time and money outside of their own parish or ecclesial superstructures for fear that it's going to weaken them. So therefore, you also have this situation where in order to maintain this kind of a strong primacy in a strong parish, particularly if we're talking about developing a new ministry where the parish priest is just simply not trained as a social worker or as a hospice worker or whatever it may be, this means that practically laity with those experiences are not free to innovate and establish new ministry and to cross-pollinate with each other. Hence the pan-Orthodox and ecumenical relationships that this work fosters are hindered. Further, orthodoxy is at many times at odds with what I would call the dominant cultural memes of our country, one in which competition and the proliferation of ideas is, and other models, we believe that fosters excellence in a fairly unregulated environment. That's just what it is to be American. Well, this cultural divergence from a parishioner's everyday experience within the church really frustrates philanthropists and entrepreneurs. And I can tell you countless stories of successful businessmen and women who are brilliant leaders, who are so frustrated with not being allowed to exercise the very gifts and charisms that God has given them, particularly for the growth in the life of the church, because of this dominant control. Next, the second barrier is terminology, and it reveals the need, I think, for greater theological clarification and dialogue between Christian communities to find a more common theological formation, because you've not heard me use the term social justice, particularly because terms like social justice, even frankly in some settings ecumenical, are problematic to many Orthodox Christians. And even outside of sophisticated, more sophisticated theological arguments that would say that Orthodox have no systematic theology, we're not going to talk about social justice as separate from Christology, as separate from, etc. Just on a very practical and human level, these terms carry kind of a suspicion and political baggage that inhibit various communities. Let's say a Catholic parish that's got a strong ethic of social justice, missionary work. You go to an Orthodox Christian parish in some parts of the country and you're not going to get very far, precisely because of what that term means to people. Thank you. So this reveals a more difficult cultural issue within Orthodoxy, but one that I found fairly universally, and that is that Orthodox don't seem, this is going to sound basic, but they don't seem to really trust each other. I know that doesn't sound very theological, but God's honest truth. When I went to these parishes, I found more suspicion of why are you here and what are you really trying to do? Right? I mean, this kind of suspicion. Now, some people have said that this comes from centuries of persecution or, fill in the blank. I'm not sure what it comes from, to be honest, but I can share with you that as an Orthodox convert to the faith some 15 years ago, it's my opinion, for what it's worth, that it's one of the major reasons why our ministries don't flourish and our stewardship is weak and our parishes are smaller. And because when I would go into a Protestant setting, even as an Orthodox Christian, thank you, Lord Jesus, and I'm so glad that you're here, and brother, how can I help you? Because if you want to serve Christ and the poor, I am with you. And you go into other congregations and they would say, oh, absolutely, because this encyclical said that we should do it. And I would go across the street to an Orthodox parish and they'd say, whatever the excuse is, we already do that, Father. Or, when we go once a quarter to the soup kitchen, we don't need to do more than that, Or you're just going to take the resources that we have, and then we're not going to have enough, on and on and on. What to do about it is going to have a whole nother symposium, but honestly, I'll come to a couple thoughts there, and then I've got to end here. But another barrier is that the current administrative dysfunction of the Orthodox churches in this country make formal approval processes for ministries absolutely required because of the local and regional insistence upon this primatial control, this centralized control. Therefore, we got to have this real approval process. Now I've got to go to the ecclesial assembly and I've got to deal with 66 or however many bishops we have now. Used to be that I could go to SCOBA and we had a couple, we had 8 or so. I mean, in some ways though, it's harder than it ever was because the new Episcopal Assembly, at least as of yet, has not given us a formal way that we can become ministry. How do we, I would ask this all of the time, and now to their credit, men and in this case men that I've talked to, they're bishops and hierarchs and laity, tell me that's coming, and that's the work of the committees. Fine. However, there are ministries available right now. How do we become approved? Right? So within the Orthodox, and this is very specific to Pan-Orthodoxy, I don't know what the analogous situation is to the Catholic world, but we can't become approved in many cases, which makes funding hard, etc. Frankly, I couldn't get into some parishes because I didn't have that approval. So I had to go to restaurants owned by parishioners. It's laughable. It is laughable. We're talking about trying to feed the poor. Lastly, there's an issue of Orthodox identity and how to remain Orthodox while engaging with others in that ministry. For example, one thing I observed is that clergy and laity alike are, fairly comfortable with Orthodox Christians going out into non-Orthodox or other ministries, even in positions of great leadership. But when we propose an Orthodox Christian ministry owned by an Orthodox, owned by meaning we're not renting the house, we own it. A renter never takes good care of the lawn as the owner does, right? So for our salvation, we need to own the house. We got to take out the trash, be responsible for this ministry, for our own salvation, our own growth. But when you propose that, all of a sudden now, the same people who could go serve in leadership in a Roman Catholic ministry or in a Protestant Baptist ministry, whatever it is, now all of a sudden it's but wait, Father, if we're going to have an Orthodox Christian ministry, how do we stay Orthodox? Well, Father, I know we don't have expertise in this particular area, maybe with the food safety, but we can't let somebody who's not Orthodox be on the, on the leadership team. How would we stay Orthodox? I mean, and more work needs to be done on that. What is it that makes up an Orthodox identity? That's one of the currents that I've been hearing again and again in this conversation. And I love the idea that Michael brought up of the container. Is there a common container that we can at least start in? It's this is what it is to be Orthodox. Orthodox, right? And you don't have to have the meter. And you were hitting the nail on the head, and it relates to this. So I guess I need to draw to a conclusion here very briefly, but I think we need trust and respect. We need to cultivate a spiritual yes. We're really good at no. I don't think so. But cultivate the spiritual yes. Yes, Lord, thy will be done. Yes, Lord, I don't know how it's possible, but you're going to provide the ability and the increase. The spiritual yes, to become a joyful underwriter, an enabler of life and the restoration of life in our parishes and in our communities. Secondly, simplicity. Leave aside, where appropriate, false sophistication and complexities. Learn to be comfortable as people with one another. We're Orthodox. Okay, whatever that means. We don't have to figure that out to go feed the poor together. Thirdly, lay aside all earthly cares. And this is an intangible aspect, but it's at the very heart of what Mother Maria Scotsova achieved. What made her saintly was this prayerful, active life that creates an emptiness in her heart that the Spirit could then fill and that could then overflow out of her on a personal level, learning to trust in God, learning to trust in the other more and more. The ground is ripe for the harvest, for new gleanings in the Orthodox, in the realm of Orthodox social theopraxis. How are we going to apply our theology to social work and ministry? Lastly, with our seminaries full, but this is important, lastly, with our seminaries full, and as I've been having conversations with Father Michael Placon and others, they have nowhere to go. Unlike the Roman Catholic situation, we have way too many priests and nowhere to go. And what if we were to take these same seminaries and fill the ranks of the parishes with educated social workers, educated counselors, educators, etc. Fill in the blank. People who did ministry, were ordained and given the task of going out to do ministry precisely to serve the liturgy on the altar of the heart of their brother and sister in need. Expanding the idea of the priesthood to all believers. So, we'll have to find the will, we'll have to take up the cross. Christ hasn't given up on us, and therefore let us not give up on him and on his church and his ministry.
And thank you, Father Justin, for your remarks, your thoughtfulness, and your passion on this issue. I'd like to introduce Dr. Francine Cardman, who teaches at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Used to teach, which used to be called the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, so that's why I'm lingering over it a bit. Dr. Cardman is a graduate of Yale, where she was trained as a historical theologian. She is a historical theologian. She wrote on Tertullian and the resurrection there. She's taught at Wesley Methodist Seminary in Washington, D.C., as well as at BC. She's also has been part of the consultation of Orthodox and Catholics that has been talked about so much at this particular gathering. She is also on the board for Network, which is a social justice lobby of the Catholic Church, pardon the use of that word, and helped found a women's theological center. She also asked me to share with you, I asked her to give us a human detail, and she said that she does dog agility work with her dogs, which apparently is like a doggy obstacle course. But anyway, let's welcome Dr. Cardman and hear what she has to say. Her title, by the way, is Catholic Social Ethics and Orthodoxy, Finding Common Ground. I neglected to do that for Father Justin. I apologize.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you all for being here this late in the day at the end of a wonderful 2 days. When people say, tell us something else you do, when I introduce students, I have students introduce each other at the start of classes and say, tell one interesting thing about yourself, one unusual thing, something weird you did this summer, whatever. Anyway, I do agility with the dogs because it's so not school and it's so not church. Like you need some other kind of reality. some of the time. I wrote one of those all-purpose titles when Nick said I needed a title, and I thought I would talk somewhere around that area, and I am talking somewhere around that area, but less about Catholic social teaching immediately or directly, more indirectly at some of the larger foundational issues that lead up to it or that it's a part of, but also issues, areas of thought that can be shared, that already are shared with Orthodox churches, theologians, and their ministries. So this talk is something more like ethics, ecclesiology, and ecumenism, finding common ground, or from common ground to common ground, because I think it's there, we just need to get back to it in some ways. Putting aside for the moment the question of where does ethics belong, if we want to speak about ethics at all in a gathering such as this in relation to various articulations of theology, and putting aside the question about whether social justice is a forbidden word or not, and what it might mean to use it or not use it, put it all aside in a gathering like this, whether Orthodox are allergic to it. We've got plenty of allergic Catholics as well. Putting all that aside, I want to go back and think about ethics for a few minutes in terms of the language of the New Testament, and then say something about the 4th century church fathers, in particular the contributions to ethics from the early church. I then want to look at some of the ecclesiological issues that pertain to thinking about both ethics and ecumenism, and thinking particularly in terms of social ministries and the way in which those social ministries might connect with ecumenism. And so some of those ecclesiological issues, and then I want to say a few more summary things about ecumenism. As Father Justin was speaking, I thought, oh, I should have let him go second, because he's a preacher and I'm not, but, and that was it was great, and thank you. And but it's also the case that if there's theory, the only place theory comes from is from practice. It comes from experience. It comes from trying to understand reality on the ground. And so I want to do some modest theological reflection in these 20 minutes. The language of the New Testament doesn't speak about ethics per se, and many New Testament scholars don't like talking about New Testament ethics. But what we do have in the New Testament is a language of Christian life. And the number of places where, especially in the Pauline letters, Paul or whoever wrote some of them, speaks about, well, not all his, clearly, where those Pauline letters, those Paul-like letters, those of them, where it speaks about living a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called. And this is an apology you need to make just as much to Lutherans and many Reformed theologies and churches, as well as to these audiences. Lutherans would hear this as, or in some ways could hear it about as salvation by works. It's not the point. So I want to just remind you of a few parts of a few passages. In Ephesians 4, at the beginning of that chapter, I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another with love, making every effort to remain in the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling. One Lord Jesus Christ, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. It's a very familiar passage. We read it, we hear it all the time. When I was reading it, when I was thinking about this and then this talk and went back to read it, I thought, well, it's really both about ethics and it's about ecumenism and it's about what it means to be church. It's all there in just those 4 verses. 2 other short verses from 1 Thessalonians and then one from Colossians. 1 Thessalonians 2:12 has a similar kind of exhortation, where Paul's saying, "We dealt with you like a father with his children, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." And then Colossians 1:10. Paul says he's praying for you so that you may lead lives worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him as you bear fruit and grow in the knowledge of God. Just with these three passages, these two short lines and the longer little bit from Ephesians, we can see, I think, that ethics or Christian morality, however you want to call it, is really about, first, our baptismal calling as Christians, secondly, about our life in the Spirit, and these both lead us to knowledge of God and to God's kingdom and glory. They do it through liturgy, certainly, and they also do it in the liturgia of the world, in the liturgy that sends us out to the world, where we pray, "Your kingdom come on earth as in heaven." We could simply call this Christian spirituality, Christian life. It's what the New Testament concept of being in Christ is about, being, living, and doing in Christ. That life in the Spirit is a life in unity. It's a life in the unity of the local, the very most local, the parish church community, and among church communities. It's also a unity among the churches that have evolved and become independent, separate church communions over the centuries and centuries of church history. But it's a unity too, and more importantly, it's a unity of humankind that this is about. The churches don't exist for themselves, they exist for something else. The unity of humankind is one big piece of that. I'll come back to say a little bit more, I'm going to be saying more about all the parts of this as I move along. Early Christian ethics as taught by the church fathers. One of the great sort of rediscoveries in the last part of the 20th century has been the social teaching of the fathers of the church. Before that, it's been really a very well-kept secret. I think because it's much more challenging than we might imagine. And we see it in unexpected places, like in the teachings of the Desert Fathers, especially in terms of charity and hospitality, but also in terms, which are obvious, I think, but also in terms of their teaching on discretion or discernment. What does this person need now in this place for their growth? What is the Spirit calling one to now, and what does charity call one to in this particular situation? And so we can learn simple things from what you could call really the ethics of the church fathers. We can learn about simplicity, a life of enough. We can learn about hospitality, immigrants. In one sense, yes, we've been great on immigrants in both our churches, and in another sense, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, not in the church as much as among Roman Catholics, we're being not so good these days. We have great official statements, actually, lately about immigrants. But among people in so many churches, the attitude of antipathy to immigrants among Christians is really shocking. We can learn about bread and how bread heals hunger. We can learn about other kinds of healing in hospices and hospitals and hostels even. We can learn about spiritual healing, the healing of souls. We can learn even some ways about moving beyond the desert experience, consolation, and the kind of healing and hope one offers to prisoners and so on. I, Paul, prisoner for the Lord, for instance. The great fathers of the late 4th century, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory the theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, they're all known to many of you. There are so many snippets of sayings of the fathers now. You can find them all over the web, everywhere. I'm not going to try to quote any of them. I'm just going to look at some of the larger principles one can draw out from their social teachings. They all speak in similar ways most of the time about a common human nature or common humanity that endows everyone with a common human dignity. And they speak about it especially in terms of the image of God in all persons. That common nature, common humanity leads to reflection on the common good, the responsibility that we have to the neighbor, to the least among us, the responsibility we have to, in fact, make a community that embodies these kinds of this kind of human dignity and care. You see it expressed sometimes in terms of giving of one's excess, once your own basic needs are met, to meet the needs of others. We also see among them, and this is some of the teaching that gets less emphasized, less attention until more recently, the notion of common goods, plural. The notion of the way in which all human beings share in the goods of creation that were intended for all, that came from God for all and that go back to God, but they are not ours, they're on loan, they're for use, commonly and equitably among all the sisters and brothers. Common goods such as air and water, and what follows from that. You can't destroy them, you can't steal them, you can't pollute them, you can't save them for yourselves, you can't dam this river for your property, and so on and so on. The fruits of the earth, food, which becomes a basic human right and a basic aspect of human dignity, and the means of creating food from the earth. One of those common goods. Natural resources, property, physical property, land, and then also material, other kinds of material property. The fathers are have astonishing critiques on property. They emphasize a common goal of humanity, of human life, a common goal being, of course, finally God, but that dictates a common way then of life, where we live both charity and justice, mercy and justice, where in fact justice becomes a kind of norm of charity. This understanding of the importance of charity and of justice, or of justice and mercy, applies both to persons, but also to structures, to systems, to societies, so that it doesn't let us stay, even in the fathers, on the level of individual care, one for another, but it also demands care at various other levels of social interaction and of living. So to heal the wounds, to relieve suffering, to remedy lack, requires not only personal care, but also that we address the conditions that create care, that create these needs. It demands that we rectify the structures that perpetuate them. Basil, again, especially saw that, so did the others in their own way. His care of the poor, the Basileas, the new city, the entire way of dealing with the famine in 368, and then institutionalizing a monastic, but also a church, therefore, response to that, is it should be instructive to us for the need for justice on a social level, and the social ministries that go with it. Ecclesiology, I just want to point out a few things in my last few minutes here. Asking questions about who and where is the church is an important part of ecclesiology, but also asking how is the church? How does it live? What message does its manner of life convey? And then questions, what is the church for? And with whom and for whom is it what it is? I have just, I want to do these as more sort of bullet point thoughts at the moment. But first, Eucharist is where we need to start thinking about this. It struck me the other day that in terms of Eucharist, and even of our discussion yesterday, we are all locavores. We're eating locally. But we're all locavores at a universal banquet. How do we work that out? And how do we make the banquet be a banquet for all? There's an essential call already to justice and mercy in life in the fact that we have Eucharist. And At the same time, if we can't eat together, how can we feed the world? What do we have to offer to heal the brokenness of the human community if we can't heal ourselves? Second, I want a word about mission. Mission is what joins the classic ecumenical divisions, faith and order, life and works. It's not just the middle term that joins them, it's the term that is the goal. The goal of what we're doing in the church, in life and works, and in faith and doctrine, is really about mission. Mission requires witness and requires ministry. It requires the witness of, and these cross. They're not just individual, this is communal. They cross at many levels. It requires the witness of faith in evangelization, but it requires also the witness of faith in how we live, what we communicate, personally and communally, institutionally. Mission, witness of our life is part of that mission. It requires ministry, both internal ministry to and for the life of the worshiping community, but it requires ministry externally, if you want, to and for the life of the local community, the contextual community. It requires this external kind of ministry ultimately for the world. Context, mission, location, responsibility. What does it mean? What must we do to be the church in this place so that we may all be part of the goal, which is the kingdom of God? Ministry. I will just mention and not go on about it, that running all through this weekend is a clear recognition, I think, of the need to talk more, and we started doing it with Father Justin, about the laity. We've talked a lot about hierarchs and patriarchs and institutional structures, and we have to because they're essential. They can either hurt our life or help our life. They're meant to serve life. But we also need to talk about the laity more in all these things in terms of social ethics, in terms of ecclesiology, in terms of ecumenism. And social ministries are precisely a place where that can come most to the fore, most easily, most quickly. And I'm not going to try to detail that further, except to say, social ministries as an expression of being church in a specific place require both mercy and justice. They demand that we hold together the most immediately and intimately local, the person in front of us, with the distant and seemingly faceless forces that work against their life, their wholeness, and their dignity at multiple levels of social and political life. They require justice as well as mercy. It's only just that their wounds be healed. It's only merciful that the means of their wounding be removed or put right. That's why it would be helpful for the churches and the individual church, the churches together, at times to be able to act together and at times to speak together publicly, to address both their members and the larger communities of which they are a part. Finally, 4 short statements about how this all interacts with ecumenism. First, patristic social ethics are already a common heritage that we can put to the service of mission. In carrying out mission both separately and quite possibly together, the social mission of the church and the churches calling us to live ecclesial lives, call us to live ecclesial lives worthy of the calling to which we've been called. Second, the papers we all heard yesterday have helped to emphasize the important connection of context and mission. And I just hold that up before us as something that's one hugely important takeaway from this weekend. Third, I have suggested that social ministries are a place where taking context and mission most seriously can lead us beyond ourselves, beyond our ethnicities, our particular churches and communities, our structures and our institutions, our individual interests, our institutional self-interests, and open us to the wider horizons of God's justice and mercy. Open us to the kingdom which comes to us on earth as in heaven. Engaging in these ministries together as Orthodox and Roman Catholics, lay and clergy, at every level, from the individual to the institutional, and crossing jurisdictional, ecclesiastical, and social boundaries as we do so, can bring into being a desire larger than ourselves, the desire to be the communion of God's love, the sacrament for the life of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. Thank you, Dr. Cardman. We want to allow them, our two wonderful speakers, about 5 minutes to respond to one another if they would like to do so.
You want me to start? You had so many good things to say. I'm trying to find a question. I agreed with so much of what you
Well,
said.
right there. I just was so surprised and happy to see the way we interconnected on many things. So we must be doing something right.
I think so. You know, I guess I'd love for you to spend another minute or two talking about, you know, the concept that you introduced that I think deserves more time, this idea of locavores at a universal banquet. And that's an intriguing thought, and I'm assuming, pardon?
Oh, I was just saying how it's cool.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good, I'm used to dialogue that way, don't be sorry. It reminded me of Father Alexander Schmemann, you know, at the beginning of For the Life of the World.
That book was hugely influential on me, you know, in graduate school, in my initial forming as a theologian. Terribly important.
Likewise, and for me, it is one of those books I try to return to once a year to remind myself kind of the theological grounding and formation that I was given. But, you know, it reminded me of the very first chapters of that we are what we eat. And that we become, as he said, and that we become the very body and blood that we consume. Can you talk a little bit more about locavores and at the universal banquet?
You know, that idea came to me, those words came to me actually yesterday. So I'm still working out how that metaphor might work, but not only are we are what we eat, but as I know Augustine's not a favorite among Orthodox, but as Augustine has shown us, we also are what we love. And it's not just about the food that we love or the this and the that, the good things, the bad things we love. If you put it in the context of this social ministry, social action discussion, loving the poor, which is to love Christ, is a way of becoming Christ. So you are what you eat, you are what you love. This universal banquet thing, I think is, the locavore image came first, I think, when I was thinking about local context and mission, and then what we do at the local level. The mission is, you know, locavore can be like beyond yuppie in terms of only the best, most organic, freshest local stuff at the best farms, and we won't even order from menus where you say your lettuce is from this farm and your dead pig is from that farm, and on like that. And that's, you know, it's consumption in excess, trying to actually. But, so I'm not thinking about that, but locavore in the sense of what the first letter of John says. How can you say you love God if you don't love your neighbor? And you know, it's the neighbor that we can see. We can't see God. So love your neighbor as a way towards loving God. So locavore that way. This is where God, and locavore rooted in this place right here. And then secondly, the universal banquet, not just the heavenly banquet that it's all, if you want, participating in, coming from and going to, or the hope of that messianic feast, but also a universal banquet now so that everyone eats. So on a very practical level. Food for people, so that banquet might look like, you know, bread and milk and eggs for a family that doesn't have any other food. So it's those connections I'm trying to sort of play with and work out.
It was interesting, when you said locavore, I immediately thought yuppie, which is funny you said, but I then began immediately to think about a book that maybe some have read called The 100-Mile Diet. And one of the things about which is really irrelevant to theology, but the idea is simply that I knew a parish in Canada who attempted to only buy everything it needed within 100 miles. So that meant that where they were in Canada, they had to find the one person in the area that could actually grow wheat, and they made their own vestments because they were only going to buy, well, nobody made vestments around there, so somebody had to learn how to. And the reason it connects for me is that in that book, one of the concepts that's illumined is this idea that scarcity produces culture. And so if we think of ourselves as locavores eating at this universal banquet, it necessitates embracing scarcity. We think of scarcity of food in a negative sense, but I also wonder whether or not we can think of the scarcity that the locavore encounters in a culture-creating positive sense, that we become more indigenously the church because of how local we are and because we remain locavores.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Hold on. Yeah, I don't have another thing to say to that. Sorry, didn't, no, go ahead.
I wanted to invite people, if they would like to ask questions, please come forward to the microphone. Questions? Thank you. Oh, sorry. I'm a little blind, please.
Is this on? No? Hi. Still not on? Okay.
Yeah, you're right.
I have a question for Father Justin about cultivating the spiritual yes, and a little bit also about the locavore mentality. When one has a very diverse community in terms of distance as well as ethnically and where we all come from, I think there are many gifts that a church community has to lend, and that we as a community will have vision and have ideas, and we will ignite some of our visions. But what I'm really interested in is how do we fan those flames? And can you speak a little more to what it is to cultivate the spiritual yes in these? For instance, right now, it took me about a year to engage the community in just a discussion group about what Orthodoxy means to us in our lives. How does it inform who we are in our lives? And it's been marvelous. Been not very well attended, but it's been amazing and has really, I think, encouraged a lot of us. Now, the next step is how do we fan the flames? How do I keep that going? And how does our community keep something like that going so we can take steps into, being Christ's presence in the world?
Two questions. One that I heard was how do we cultivate a spiritual yes, and the second was fanning the flames. The idea of the spiritual yes actually comes from a number of sources, but one of the chief among them was Mother Gavrilia of India, who there's a great book called The Aesthetic of Love that I read, and she had the practice, she didn't call it that, but she had the practice of trying always to say yes. So when people would ask her, could I have this? Would you go here? Would you take me to? She would do her very best just to say yes on a daily basis. And I found analogously to that, my wife and I have talked about how can we say yes more often to our kids? Seriously, how often do I say, no, you can't have that. No, stop touching that. No, is that really what we want God to be like for us? Is that what he is like for us? And so how can we how can we, created in the image of God, become more like him by saying yes more often to things that give life? So in terms of practicing that, I think it's a daily struggle, and it often comes in simple things like making oatmeal. I learned everything I learned in seminary by making oatmeal, because In the morning, my son, Asher, would wake up. He was, what, 4, 3? How old was he?
5 months old.
Well, but at the end of seminary, he was like 2.5, 3 years old. And by that time, he was old enough to kind of like a 3, get up out of bed and come wake me up really early, after I'd been up studying really late. And he would say, Daddy, I need breakfast. I want oatmeal. And everything in me said, get away from me, kid. I'm tired. Don't you know how hard I worked? And we'll get up in a couple of hours, you know. But the Christian life, true discipleship, my salvation at that moment was bound up with forcing myself up out of bed to go make oatmeal for a child who was hungry. And so it's not very complex. The second thing, fanning the flames, certainly you can read a lot in the scriptures and in the fathers about that. Certainly I think good preaching, when cultivated, is very important within the parish community, something that I think is being recovered, but that certainly I and others want to work on. But I also think, though, that somebody said to me recently, my spiritual father said to me recently, he said, you know, what inspires you? Because I was feeling fairly uninspired recently in the last half year about a particular situation. He said, what inspires you? Go do that. Go walk in the woods. Go pray outside. Go play the guitar. Go whatever. And I think so often we kind of over-spiritualize our lives and sort of think like, in order to fan the flames, I've got to do something more spiritual. In reality, it's go live.
I'm speaking very practically,
Yeah.
because I'm,
Yeah.
because I do the ministry in the world, I just don't happen to be able to do it in my church, and I'm trying to figure out how can we lend our talents to really make that happen? How do we, once we engage people, then how do we continue that?
I'd like to let Francine answer this also, but I think that the idea of how do we do it, some of that is very practical. We need to be given the freedom, and we need to, as Ephesians says, you know, the work of the priest is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, not to go do all the ministry. So, you know, I think that, you know, as the priest is the parish, and so in some regard, you have to have clergy trained up to go do the training. But I also think you just have to have courage, which is a weapon we have to use in the spiritual life, to go and do. And then sometimes, you know, I think about, you know, the saying of Dorothy Day that Father Michael worked with and has taught me a lot about, actually, you know, in my internship with him, that sometimes, you know, you don't ask for permission for that which God's already commanded you to do.
The only thing I would say to that is, and I often say it is, and it's this question of do you need approval or not, and it's really just do it. So maybe it's not an official ministry of Saint so-and-so church at the moment, but just do it. These people are doing it, others will follow. And then at some point they'll say, oh yeah, we always did this ministry.
And I think the hard thing there, particularly, because I know you go to an Orthodox parish, and we talked earlier, I mean, I think the hard thing there is that particularly in an American Orthodox context, we are trying to recover this, because we're such an individualistic society, we're trying to recover the notion of community and my life within community and spiritual fatherhood and motherhood and discipline and being obedient and all of those things that within a proper context are absolutely vital to the Christian life. However, with good guidance and with the reflection of your priest and others, you know, if you're married, your spouse, those kinds of things, I think you have to remember that God didn't tell you to check your brain at the door when you became chrismed or baptized. I mean, that we have a spiritual responsibility to go live out the gospel, and that we do that responsibly. So it has to be worked out. But the study group is a great way to begin. I also found that the other way to begin is simply to announce a date. Honestly. On, you know, April 14th, we are going to go here. Anybody who wants to come, come.
That's a
And simply, when we would start focus ministries, you know, it was sort of like, okay, we're going to get together and gather 5 or 6 people for what we called an in-gathering, kind of share the vision. The very next step was, okay, everybody's excited? Next week we're going. Come on. Well, but wait, Father, don't we need to plan it out? Yeah, we'll do that. But just come and taste and see. Whet the appetite.
That's awesome. I wish most committees worked like that. One meeting and then let's do it.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Please.
For Dr. Cardman, I was wondering if you can give just one or two one or two concrete examples about one of the Desert Fathers being an exemplar of social justice, since they're usually seen of living such an interior life. And for Father Matthews, I was wondering if you were able to illuminate a little further on the structure of SCOBA, how that may parallel the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and if you can touch on that one saint you mentioned earlier at the beginning. I was getting vestiges and vibes of Vincent de Paul and Dorothy Day when you were talking about her.
Okay, I wouldn't say they're exactly examples of social justice in the way we might think about it today, but they're one of the things that's so surprising about the Desert Fathers is how long the section of sayings on charity is. And it's about the kinds of charity that are demanded living in this kind of community that's not community, it's drop in, drop out, people wandering around looking for their spiritual teachers, and so on. But what they see clearly is that charity overrides almost everything. You should be fasting now, you're eating because you've got a guest here. Well, yeah, that's much more important. Hospitality, charity to this guest. You should be, so the charity part is one really huge part about that to me. So much of what they say about discernment, yes, it's about, in those situations, it's often about interior matters of discernment, but sometimes it's about matters of behavior. This brother did this and he was mad about that, and you let him go on and do something else instead. Why did you do that? So, but the kind of discernment where basically where the Sabbath was made not for man, not man for the Sabbath sorts of reasoning come into play. I think that works a lot about justice as well. And a lot of that discernment stuff is about what does this person need here now, not what's the rule. So where they extend outward beyond that, I think, is some of the stuff about the hospitality to strangers wandering through. Also the way in which, in time, as those communities got more monastic, they created sort of a combination of hospitals and hostels. So you always welcome the stranger. And some people who are studying early Desert Fathers argue for these monastic hospitals as really the origin of hospitals and healthcare in the Western world. And that's beyond more than just charity then. It becomes much more structural. So in that sense, these things can lead us to think about in that direction.
I mean, what you said right there obviously reminds me of St. Basil the Great's rule.
Exactly.
St. Basil the Great in his rule has charity and particularly the feeding of the hungry built into the rule for every one of his 100 communities or so that he had. I'm trying to remember exactly what your question was for me. I really think that I would love to talk to you maybe after the forum about the structure of SCOBA and the Episcopal Assembly, but we'll put everybody to sleep if we talk about that.
One of these, who was the female saint you were discussing early on?
Yeah, Saint Mother Maria Skotsova. She was a Russian immigrant to Paris. Just before World War II, she actually died in a Nazi concentration camp. There's a great series of articles about her on the website incommunion.org. And In Communion is run by Jim Forrest and Nancy Forrest, and they have, the Orthodox Peace Fellowship has a wonderful live of the saints, of her particularly. And she definitely resonates, she definitely resonates with Dorothy Day and with St. John of Kronstadt is another one that I really look up to, who ran one of these kind of social entrepreneurial enterprises. He started a hat shop, a felt hat shop to employ the poor in Kronstadt, and then took the proceeds from that to start a school and began to educate people. And I mean, you can look through the lives of not just the ancient church fathers, but you can see that theopraxis continued forward in so many ways. Today, for whatever reason, in our churches, particularly in the Orthodox Christian churches, we've been so busy struggling to be that we haven't done a lot of that. And, you know, we could fault each other for that, but also there's a good short story of a young boy, grandson, who was serving a meal at Reconciliation Ministries, Focus Kansas City, the main office in Kansas City, a couple of years back, and he was, you know, serving trays of food to the poor that were coming to the ministry there at 31st and Troost, where our church is. And he said, yeah, grandmother, if this is what it is to be Orthodox, you know, to feed and to care for the poor, why haven't we always done this? And she just looked at him as she was, you know, stirring this big pot of soup and said, son, we were the poor. We did do this for each other for decades. And I get tired of that as an excuse for why we don't do it now, because that is not the reality of current Orthodoxy in America. We're actually fairly well educated and wealthy right now. I've read that the Orthodox Christian community per capita has the most master's degrees or something. That may or may not be correct. But in other words, we're doing okay. But up until now, there are some good reasons why institutionally we haven't had an exceptional social justice or social action ministry. But the time is now.
Thanks. Please.
So that actually goes off of what my question is. I grew up in the Orthodox Church. I was an active member, Sunday school teacher, summer camp counselor, all that. And that's why I feel comfortable saying that I feel like there's a fundamental problem within the church, that we don't really have that many outreach programs, or at least as parishioners, we're not very aware of them. And I understand that there's an effort to make us more aware. But my question is, what do you think, like, as priests or clergy, you guys can do to make us more aware? I understand the parishioner's importance in the situation, but I also feel like the priest is a very crucial aspect of creating an outreach program so we can become an effective member of our community and help those who are in need.
First of all, I think that the question that you're asking is really, it's almost like a poster child question for I have no idea how old you are exactly, I'm 20. But for your age and people who are in our generation, they are the social contract that worked for our parents and grandparents. Let's all move here, let's build a building, you know, that was enough. Let's have a liturgy, that was enough. The next generation, our generation and younger, that doesn't work anymore. That social contract has, you know, it's breached, and they want the rubber to meet the road. They're ready for some work. You know, like St. Luke begins his gospel with, you know, something along the lines of the recording or the writing of all that Jesus came to do and teach. Well, certainly there is more doing left. And I think that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people your age. I certainly think that there are national institutional structures in place now, International Orthodox Christian Charities, Focus North America, Project Mexico, right down the road from you, Orthodox San Diego. You can find, Mary and Martha House here in California. I'm trying to think of other ones. There are a lot. OCF here in town and at this college. I know there's a small OCF here at the college. You know, I think there are more and more institutional vessels for you to get involved in now, to pour yourself into. However, I think the real exciting stuff is when I see young folks who are just becoming disciples of Jesus Christ and not waiting for somebody else to go create the structure for them. You don't need the formality to go and serve the poor. You know, there was a guy at seminary who, you know, he was really quiet, and I remember he never would have thought he was going out to do work, but he was going to White Castle because he had very little money. He would load up on, we call them belly bombers, and go and feed people, you know? And it was that simple. So, yes, we need more, particularly because I talked about that centralization of control. People wait for the priest to give them permission. Some of that's good, some of that's not good. There's a balance between primacy and all of that, conciliarity. But in your case, you know, get your friends and go do.
Yeah, I guess I was just saying that I feel like the priest should be the one spearheading it. Because, you know, we looked at our spiritual fathers for leadership, and that's where I was coming from.
I would challenge your assumption only gently that the priest is the one that should spearhead that effort. You're a priest too.
Yes.
You were baptized. You put on a white robe and a cross. I wear mine on the outside. You'll wear yours when you die. But you were a priest also, and that's Orthodox. So what I'm saying, and I understand what you're saying. I'm not trying to be flippant or radical or controversial, but what I am saying is that we need you to go and to teach and to lead. And the priests need to facilitate you being able to do that. So go find a priest who's willing to bless you to do that and work with him.
Thank you. Our final question.
Hi, thank you both very much for such, I don't think it's on. Okay. Thank you both very much for such a wonderful discussion. I am Roman Catholic, and I want to address some of the barriers that you spoke of, Father Matthews, and this question is for both of you. I remember being very struck. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I go back and I volunteer there very often. I remember being very struck when they were voting on whether to legalize gay marriage. Thousands of people came out to the streets on both sides, and I remember seeing it in person and seeing it on the news. And that very same day, I went to what we call villas, or the slums outside of Buenos Aires, and engaging and talking to children who are living in extreme poverty. And I was very struck by the fact that we're so motivated in certain areas of justice, whatever side you're on in this debate or whatever debates, especially if they affect us directly, and the poor are often invisible or forgotten. So my question is basically, how do we cultivate in ourselves and in others an attitude of justice, but ongoing justice, not just we're going to fundraise clothing this weekend, we're going to build a house in Mexico, we're going to go to a soup kitchen. How do we cultivate this ongoing attitude to always think of and work with and for the forgotten and the invisible, specifically the poor?
Small question.
You take that one.
I take that one. Not really. I was going to say read the scriptures, and I do mean that, actually. And maybe that's enough of an answer in the way I'm trying to think. I think it takes community to do that, but the community can be a few friends. The community can be, doesn't have to be necessarily inside the church. But I would put, read the scriptures, read the LA Times, right? I mean, I think those are really crucial and simple. And then talk with friends.
Martyrdom.
Oh, good, well, you said that.
Go die for it. I mean, honestly, if you look at what's sustained the church throughout the years, who are the saints that inspire us? They're the ones that went out, and whether it be a red martyrdom, they actually were killed, or, a martyrdom simply of confessing the faith during great times of persecution, particularly the youth, but everybody, but particularly the youth. That's what they want to be called to. What do I die for? They want to die for something. And I think if we want sustained activity, we've got to be willing to go out and die for it ourselves. Now, the rubber meets the road when, it's not fashionable or fun anymore to go feed the poor, and you're tired of going down there after 6 months. And I've worked in homeless shelters or some sort of ministry like that, even in the administrative side of it, for 10, 15 years, and it gets to be tedious, boring, hard work. But when you go down and you meet somebody who's doing it day in and day out and giving of themselves unto death, that's what inspires you to keep going. Martyrdom. And, it reminds me of Saint Seraphim of Sarav, acquire the spirit of peace, and 1,000 around you will be saved. I don't think he means by that, just go pray by yourself and God will save a bunch of people around you. I mean, to acquire the spirit of peace, the Holy Spirit within you, is to have the fruits of the Spirit, to live the fruits of the Spirit, and to give the fruits of the Spirit unto the cross, until we die. So
I think we'll end there with martyrdom. And we want to thank Father Matthews and Dr. Cardman for their excellent remarks.
Thank you very much. It's time for us to conclude the symposium. And in conclusion, to begin with, I'm going to logistically ask all of those whom we have invited to speak and who have spoken to come forward for the closing session, which will be brief.
Where do you want us to speak?
We're going to place more chairs up there so you can stay.
It's cultivate my laziness. Yeah. Do I need to
So in conclusion, we've had lots of presentations, intersecting ideas, very bold challenges that touch not only on Orthodoxy in North America, but ecumenism, the relationship between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, and indeed all of Christianity. And so I'm going to ask each speaker, starting with Father Radu, going down to the end, to briefly reflect, and you can share your microphones, for about 1 minute each. Dr. Wood, yesterday in the first session, pondered what might be possible. And having been through all of these sessions, I'm just going to ask each speaker to offer about a 1 minute reflection on moving forward, having heard all of these presentations, what they think might be possible. Father Radu.
What can we do to become a local church here in the United States? And I think to diagnose the problem in a very general way but concrete is to say that we do not love each other enough. And by that I don't mean that we dislike each other, I mean that we're indifferent to our divisions. We are insensitive to the fact that we are separated. And so in order to come together, it seems to me that it's a moment of grace that the Episcopal Assembly is continuing the work of SCOBA. And that is the given reality. We have to be realistic. What can be done? Let's start from there. They have many committees, they have many ministries, and that is one structure, to put it briefly, that is one structure of diaconia, liturgia, martyria. Diaconia means that they're serving in society, and we heard about the ways in which we are serving. By they, we mean the reflection of what is already happening in the trenches. Liturgical, hopefully we'll soon have a common translation of the liturgy. We'd better begin saying the prayer Our Father together. We're not able at this point. The creed, hopefully we'll be able to say together. And it would be wonderful if in a certain city where there are various jurisdictions, we would not have liturgies in one parish when there is a feast day in another parish, even though in another jurisdiction. So we would have a liturgical life in common, confess Orthodoxy together from big projects such as a common Bible translation that came out. We're having Ancient Faith Radio to other local ministries. So again, there is one structure of diaconia, liturgia, martyria that needs to be enhanced. But one point I was trying to make yesterday was that these Orthodox structures also provide a model for Orthodox Catholic unity. So the next step should be to bring together Catholics in some of these ministries. And in all of them, it actually works. We can have a week of prayer, like there is already in place for liturgy. We can have common confession of faith on certain social issues. We have ways to serve in society together, as we heard today. Being side by side, we would reflect together the kingdom, and we will resemble more and more those whom we love, Christ.
Dr. DeVille? Thank you, Father Radu.
I think just two things very quickly that come to mind just as you were talking. I was remembering something I learned more than 20 years ago when I went to Australia to the World Council of Churches General Assembly in 1991. What was, you don't hear it discussed very much today, I don't think, but what seems to have been a very formative and famous principle at the time, the Lund principle. Do nothing, do everything together, except where you have to be separate. It's maybe not the best paraphrase, but I think that's a helpful sort of meta principle, as it were. The other thing that I think has been a common theme through much of our discussion this weekend is another famous saying, certainly one that I've heard a lot, and that is simply, remember, it's much easier to ask forgiveness than permission. And so, you know, some of the discussions just even a few moments ago, we go out, we push to start ministries to the poor, we push people who aren't interested in the search for unity, we challenge, we say, well, I'm just going to go and do it. And if I get myself in trouble, well, I'll deal with that after the fact. But if I'm going to wait around for somebody to give me permission, you know, the Peruzzi will be here before that happens.
Thank you. Father Justin.
I think, this idea of trust one another is really central and undergirds all of this. In the Orthodox Christian context, cultivating respect and trust for the fullness of our traditions, and yet knowing that their tradition or their ministry doesn't denigrate or take away from my tradition, our ministry, and in the same way, extending that trust to other Christians and being willing to be a little bit more like, speaking as an Orthodox Christian, our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic Church, who, my impression is, are more permissive. They're more, meaning they encourage ministry. They have the whole concept of the apostolate, the whole idea of, lay orders or movements. There's a diversity of ministry, and cultivating trust in God and in one another, and being willing to say yes and have courage and trust God for the outcome. I mean, to me, that, again, it just boils down to that. From the bishops getting together to have mutual goodwill, to the parish that wants to start a ministry, trust one another and respect one another radically.
Thank you, Father Justin. Dr. Carter.
Well, I had a two-part thought, but one part left already, so maybe it will come back before we're finished. But I think the simple second part maybe could be summed up as, don't ask, do tell. But in this case, just do it. Don't ask. Don't wait for approval. Do what you can do now. And as you push the envelope, at some point, fine, tell about it. And, you've pushed the envelope and you're not dead. So don't ask, do tell.
Thank you, Dr. Carmen. Dr. Cohen.
About a dozen thoughts have come and gone in the last 20 minutes as I've prepared to say something here. But something that Father Justin mentioned, we become more indigenously the church. I've been thinking about how the very process of passing a number of churches that you not only don't go to, but that you have absolutely nothing to do with on any level, whether they're churches in your own Orthodox tradition of another jurisdiction or churches of another Christian tradition, does something internally to your soul. And I think that we should make it something we're really concerned with, that we can't isolate. Isolation is the thing that kills us. So whether it's a small gesture of being involved in some event that's taking place, or clergy associations that we've heard talked about, social outreach ministries, ecumenical dialogues. There's so many levels, and I think we need a top-down, bottom-up approach to these problems, all working together. But yeah, so that's one, and I also think that can lead then to the church being more indigenously the church by, for example, engaging city councils. It's really deadening of life. We have people, I have students who are, bored, restless, addicted to pornography or this or that, or, all the things that we're struggling with, when there's a world of action, theological action to be done, but we have to start where we are by being aware of the world right around us, and I think this is very possible.
Can I take that back? The second part came back, just as you were talking. It's always nice. Sometimes you never see that thought again. But it was simply, I was thinking also about yesterday, and how actually part of each talk yesterday brought clearer, made more clear to me that so much of our problem in terms of ecumenism, whether it's pan-Orthodox or Orthodox Catholic or any other of the sort of combinations, is failure of will. We have had 40, 50 good years of dialogue, bilaterally, multilaterally, in the World Council of Churches, and so on. We have to will to do this. And so maybe another, we could have communion today with the Orthodox and the Catholic churches if we really wanted it. So that's another part of don't ask, do tell.
Thank you. Dr. Haran?
A couple of themes that I think I've learned from all of the people at this table and from the good questions and answers I've heard from these microphones. This really is the moment of lay people everywhere. The ecumenical movement is alive and well in kitchens across America because people are marrying, they're falling in love with Orthodox and Catholics and Presbyterians and you name it. And so this question of will is such an important one. The two things I think I learned today that were particularly helpful this afternoon is that you reminded me again that the way the gospel works is that we do it and then we reflect upon it. And so there was just so much wisdom in this final session about the necessity, the rightness, the desire of God that we be in communion with each other when we are doing what we have received, and even if we haven't received it, that we're doing this, and then we might go back and praise and reflect and become more the community that we hope to become precisely because we've done the gospel.
Thank you. Dr. Plekon?
I'm reminded of what Father Afanasiev said over and over again, that the description of the church in the Acts of the Apostles was that they were all together in one place for the same thing, epi to auto. And it's interesting that we find ourselves looking to the future, but going back to the past. Smaller buildings, smaller communities, less resources, but we can still do the work of the gospel.
And now it's time for me to begin a multitude of thank yous. I'll keep them brief. I'd first like to thank again the Henry Luce Foundation for making this symposium possible. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Michael Huffington for his generosity, the members of the advisory board, and the administration, faculty, students, and staff of the university, and especially the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts for bringing us together today. A special thanks to Catherine Lash, who is the administrative assistant. For her truly heroic efforts in making these symposia truly work. So thank you, Kat. We've had so many ideas, and I won't reprise them here. Picking up on where Dr. Brown left off. All of us live, work, study, and play together. Our children go to the same schools. They get married. And whenever we have crises or ideas, they do impact everyone. They're not just the domain of bishops. And so the state of ecumenical relations matter to everyone, and it doesn't matter how inconspicuous or innocuous a participant who experiences the consequences of division, because it impacts every person. We're going to keep this discussion going here at this university, and I hope that as you depart and head to wherever your homes are, parishes, and have discussions with your colleagues, that you'll inaugurate these discussions and think about how to continue the dynamic interplay between theory and praxis. I'd like to propose to you one final possibility to consider before we conclude, and I promise that I'll keep it brief. If we truly have this will to have a strong orthodoxy in America, and truly are seeking to have the will to bring Orthodox Catholics and indeed all Christians back into one community, then I think that we must also consider the most important liturgical discipline that everyone engages when they go to church. That is to hear God speak. Perhaps, and I think we can say with some clarity and courage, that God has spoken throughout these 2 days. Let us be like the women who are at Jesus' tomb at the end of Mark's gospel. They heard a young man speak, and he told them to go and to tell the apostles that he is risen. St. Mark says that they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is a puzzling episode, and to borrow a phrase that's been used, perhaps one might say pessimistic. But perhaps it wasn't because they were frozen in action, but they simply let that word sink in. Because the apostolic tradition tells us that indeed they did go and tell the apostles and shared that message with everyone, whether they deserved to hear it or not. Let us also, having heard and listened to God's word, now act in response. Because when we open this space, the discourse that we have engaged accommodates God's will, God's say. And then despite whatever obstacles have been created, whatever our limitations, whatever our structures, bureaucratic frustrations, when God wills and God speaks, the impossible can become not only possible, but lived and experienced by God's grace. This closes the 2012 Huffington Ecumenical Symposium. We thank our speakers, and we're especially grateful to all of you, and of course to those who had to leave early, for being with us. We will have future events. Tentatively this fall, we hope to have an event that will focus on the city as the desert, how to find spirituality in the urban life of 24/7. And we will inform you of the date of that event and its details, and you are always welcome to be with us and to join us for these events. Thank you, and have a good weekend.